20. 1,720 is a bid.
30.
30. 1730. He bids again. 40.
50.
50. He bids again.
50.
Are you up to it? 80. This man means business. 90.
90 here.
1.8. Going, gone. Sold. Congratulations.
Hello, and welcome to the First Brick Property Podcast, episode 2. My name is KM. I'm the director of First Brick Property Buyers Agency. Now, before I introduce my co-host for today, let me share what this podcast is about and why we have started this podcast. The purpose of the show is to bring a casual style show to discuss all things property, with education being the key. Our episodes will range from discussing a variety of topics to having special guests on who can share insights into the property world. Whether you're a beginner or a seasoned property investor, we believe this show will be able to further your knowledge and really remove any barriers to getting involved in the exciting and fun world of property. Now, without further ado, let me introduce my co-host for today, who, if you turned into episode number 1, you will know he decided he had more important things to do than be on Australia's newest property podcast. Henny Rosdi, how are you, mate?
I'm very well. How are you?
Not too bad.
That's good. Thanks for having me on the show. My deepest and sincerest apologies for not being able to make it last week. And I appreciate that you threw me under the bus in last week's episode as well.
That's all right. That's what we do best. Before we get on, would you like to say a few words about yourself, your background, what you do for a living?
Yeah. So my day job is very simply that I'm an accountant. I work very heavily in tax. We work with businesses with regards to their tax returns, their financial statements, and everything around that area of work. I've been doing it for about 10 years now, a bit more. And it's actually pretty good. I'm one of the very few people in the world who actually enjoy tax.
Yeah, you must be. It seems like a pretty boring topic. We might have to get you on as a special co-host guest for a tax episode later on in the line.
Can't wait.
So just another thing before we start. Last week we got a little bit of feedback that we had some echoes. So I've gone out and purchased this really expensive high-tech microphone. What do you think, Henny?
It does look pretty good. Hopefully you know how to use it.
Yeah, I have no idea what the settings are, but we'll let the listeners get back to us on that. So we'll jump into the podcast now. So last week we discussed why you should invest in real estate and why it's a good choice in comparison to some other investment vehicles. If you haven't tuned into that episode, make sure you do. Today, Henny, I thought it might be a good idea to talk about how to choose the right property and the steps involved. As you and I know, not all properties are created equal.
They're definitely not. I reckon that's a good place to start. Let's kick it up.
Beautiful. So firstly, we've listed about 6 steps, and we'll quickly list off those 6 steps and we'll go into them deeper. Do you want to list those steps for us, Henny?
All right. So the first step is to have a goal in mind. Then you need to get your finance sorted. After that, you need to have a strategy. Then you need to crunch the numbers, which personally is my favorite step. Then you need to do some research. And after that, the final step is to do your due diligence.
Beautiful. So we'll go into those steps in a bit of detail now. So step number 1 you mentioned was setting a goal. So when you're looking at purchasing an investment property, it really is important to start with the end in mind. And what do we mean by that? So setting a goal, too often people start buying property without an end goal, which can make life very difficult when it comes to future acquisitions if you don't know where you're trying to get to. So really think to yourself, what's your end goal?
Yeah, that's a really good point because, is it that you want to purchase 10 different properties that are worth a bit less? Do you want to purchase a $2 million property? Is it a certain amount of passive income that you're trying to get by the time you retire on, say, a 50K salary? But setting an end goal will really make life more easy when it comes to making these buying decisions, as you have a path to follow.
Yeah, for sure. I always tell people when it comes to this, it's like having a roadmap or a navigator from your home to wherever your destination is. Your navigator builds your route, it tells you the best way to get there. And if things pop up along the journey, there may be a road closure or an accident. That accident could mean you're having a baby in real life, and that's going to cause some financial roadblocks. But what happens is the navigator reroutes and finds a new path to the destination. So the path might change, But if you know your destination, you know how to get there, no matter what obstacles come up your way.
So it definitely makes sense to have a goal as your first step, and more specifically, the end goal in mind when you start.
Beautiful. So that's a pretty easy step number one. Start with the end goal in mind. What's step number two?
Securing your finance. Now, securing your finance, a lot of people do this step later on, and it can really complicate things if you do it that way. A lot of people find a place. Let's face it, the first thing you want to do is just jump on the internet and start looking for a property. So they find a place they want to buy first, and then they try and figure out how to make their finances work and how they're going to pay for this property that they've just found. The issue with doing that is, well, one, you might not get the finance and you've wasted a lot of time. And two, you get the finance, but obtaining the finance isn't a one-day job. And by the time the finances come around, someone else is ready to go and has already purchased that property.
Yeah, so obtaining your finance first ensures you avoid those two situations. But what I think more importantly as well is obtaining finance really allows you to know what you're actually looking for. Getting finance for $500,000 in comparison to $1 million, it's going to expose you to two very, very different types of markets. And you don't want to be looking at $500,000 properties when you have a much bigger budget, or be looking at $1 million properties when you have a much smaller budget. It's really a lot of time wasting. So obtain your finance first, speak to your broker, do all your documentation before moving on. A bit of a side note, while obtaining finance, the broker can give you a guide of how much you might be able to borrow. And while they're doing the rest of the work and the rest of the background, documentation and speaking to the banks on your behalf, you can at least at that point start to look if you want to jump into the looking stage. But at least that way you've been given a guide. So always get your finance first.
It is really one of those important preparation stages that you really shouldn't disregard. It's something that you should do very early on, and it's really important that you do it before you start looking for any property.
Beautiful. So we've said firstly, start with the end in mind, set a goal. Secondly, obtain your finance. Third point is to build a strategy. Now, strategizing and starting with the end in mind might sound like they're the same thing, but they are indeed different. Setting a strategy, it's to achieve your goals, it's to get to the end point. So looking at your current situation and where you want to be at the end, you'll then be able to set a strategy. For example, you may be on a single income, low income, and thus, to buy property number 2 or property number 3, you might need more income to be able to service those loans. So in this situation, you might decide that you need a higher yield property rather than a higher growth property to start. Or maybe, your dual income, high salaries, and yield isn't really that important to you. So, because your salary can make your payments off your salary. So in that case, you might just jump into a capital growth property. Or you might find that you need a mix of yield and growth. So what you need at that particular stage in your portfolio is really dependent on building your strategy. Whatever you find, you'll need to set a strategy first to know what to actually look for when choosing the right property.
So basically, what that really means is you've set your goal, and your strategy is what you're going to do to end up at that goal, what you're going to do to achieve the goal, which is the end goal that you want to be at.
Beautiful. So we've set our end goal, we've obtained our finance, we've set a strategy. Is it time for me to jump on Real Estate Henny and start looking at properties?
No, apparently not. We've reached the absolute greatest step, which is crunching the numbers.
So really the most boring step.
The greatest step. Now, this can actually tie in with the previous step of strategizing, but it is important to really do your numbers. Cash flow is king. Can you repeat that for me?
Cash flow is king.
This is a really important step, because if you run out of money, you won't be able to keep the property. And this is really a situation we don't want to get into. What do we mean by doing our numbers though, Kim?
So when we say doing our numbers, here's an example, might make it a bit easier of what it means. We're looking at what is it going to cost to own an investment property? How much is it going to cost me to maintain and hold the property? So we recommend that you look at the cost of servicing the loan on an after-tax basis. That way you can put the cost in real terms for you. So I'll give you a real quick, easy number example, and you can correct my numbers if I'm wrong, since you're the money number man. If we have a purchase price of the property for $500,000, stamp duty and other costs, let's say $20,000. So the amount borrowed here is $520,000. If your rent that you're receiving is $450 a week, we also look at some ongoing costs such as interest, say at 5% per annum. I know it's a bit high, but easy number. So that's $26,000 a year in interest. You got some rates and land tax. So rates about $1,500, land tax about $804. You got property manager fee 7%. It's about $1,500. Sorry. You got some insurance at $500. Let's put these numbers together. So our total cost for running or for maintaining this property is $30,000, $422, for example, minus the rent of about $23,000, which is the $450 we said earlier, times by 52 weeks in the year, which means you're looking at a $7,000 loss a year, minus some tax deductions. If we assume you're at the top rate of 45%, it's about $3,000 there. So your annual after-tax costs about $3,900, which is equivalent to about $75 a week. That's not too much, is it, Henny?
Well, it all depends, doesn't it? But no, generally speaking,
That's true.
yeah. But you mentioned something earlier, serviceability of the loan, and it is really important to look at that, again, with your after-tax figures as well, not your gross tax figures. Because what happened with me when I came to buy my first property, we had a chat to the bank, and before we even had a chat to them, I just worked out how much we'd be able to spare after looking at, our expenses and everything that we already had. And the bank was willing to give us a lot more than what I would have been comfortable to repay. So that's why it's a good understanding to have an idea of how much extra cash you've got and whether you'll be able to service the loan. Now, this was pre-GFC, so the banks are a bit more lenient. They're a bit more stringent now, but it is something that you really need to be aware of. You need to know how much you can afford and make sure that you don't overstretch yourself so you don't end up in mortgage stress.
Very, very good point. So I think when you do your numbers as well, getting into property might seem like a very daunting and expensive task. But when you do your numbers and you really break it down, I mentioned $75 isn't too much. Probably, like you said, it is dependent and variable on everyone's situation. But if you look at $75, another way to think of that is that's a full petrol tank a week, or maybe one dinner a week that you sacrifice. And just sacrificing that one dinner a week, you and your partner or you and your family, that can get you into an investment property. So it's very important that you do your numbers and really break it down. So you can really see that sometimes it's not a daunting task, or in reverse, you can see that the property that you're looking at is potentially way out of reach. So very important you do your numbers here.
Yeah, and you're right. It is something that a lot of people don't like to do because it means sitting down, looking at what your daily expenses are, what your weekly expenses are, what your variable, what your fixed costs are, what you can afford to spare. And it means doing things like going through your bank statements, going through your credit card statements, and just really pinpointing where your money goes and how much you can spare and what you can afford to live without. And it's not something that people want to do. It is a very daunting task, but I cannot stress enough the importance of sitting down and going through those numbers.
100%. And as you can hear, listeners, he's very passionate about numbers because he's an accountant. So with this step, definitely engage your accountant to help you with this. You don't have to do it yourself. With property, we always say you've got to build your property team around you, your solicitors, your accountants, your financial advisors, your buyer's agents, for example. With this step, if the numbers are looking a bit daunting, definitely engage your accountant to get you some help with pulling out the numbers and really working it out. Before we move on to the next step, Penny, I'd just like to point out there is a really awesome free app available in the App Store on both Apple and Android. It's called the Property Calculator Australia. And essentially, you just plug in your state, your purchase price, and you can play around with the interest rate, the type of loan. And it will split your costs up into repayments weekly, fortnightly, monthly, as well as calculate your stamp duty, your deposit needed, LMI if you have to pay it. If you're thinking what's LMI, we'll get into that in another episode very soon. But it's really a fantastic app. It takes about 30 seconds for me to put in all the data, all the numbers, and it spits out all the information I need. It is fantastic. I use it all the time for our clients at First Brick Property Buyers Agency. I use it all the time. It is really amazing. You should definitely jump onto the App Store and download that. It's a free app, like I mentioned. We'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. So if you are interested, you can find that very easily. Really good way to just do some easy numbers.
Sounds pretty good. All right. So moving on to the next step, which is how to choose the right investment property. In other words, research.
Yeah. So research. That's just like jumping on realestate.com domain, having a look. Yeah. Finally.
No, well, researching is very different to searching.
What do you mean? What does that even mean?
Well, unfortunately, it's not that simple.
It's not as simple as jumping on real estate. No, it's not. All right. I'll tell you why. So it's very important to know, research is a really big point. And why it's different to searching is because when you're searching, you're just online, you're having a look at properties, you have no data, you have no understanding behind what those properties really mean. What are the numbers behind the properties? So first, it's important to know that owner-occupiers are price makers and investors are price takers. And you're probably thinking, this guy just said a random quote in the middle of an episode, means nothing. And I kind of did because I lost where I was on the page. But what we're trying to say at this point is you have to really do your research and look at the data, because owner-occupiers are pretty much the people who run the market. Now, if you remember from the first episode, we mentioned the property market is the only market in the world that's not dominated by investors. And it's because owner-occupiers are very emotional. They're emotional about the decision because they're purchasing a place they want to live. So they're not thinking with their calculators, they're thinking with their heart. And they'll pay top dollar if they find a property they want to live in. And they'll go way above the typical value for that suburb, or the typical normal prices that you see in those areas, because they found a place that they've envisioned their family growing up, they've envisioned the kids playing in the backyard. So they'll pay top dollar, well above and beyond. And they really set the tone for a market. And they set the tone for capital growth. Whereas investors, for example, they're going to calculate with their calculator. If the numbers don't stack up, the investors won't buy. So when you're researching, you really want to look at properties or areas that are owner-occupier heavy. There's more owner-occupiers in the area than investors. So,
I'll give you an example about an owner-occupier purchasing with their heart. So one of the things that's really important to a lot of families, particularly ones with children, is the school district. And it's to the point now that even if you jump on Domain, you can search for properties that specifically fall within the school district. So instead of putting a suburb into Domain, you can put in a school district, and Domain will spit out houses that fall within that school district. So that is a perfect example of an owner-occupier looking and purchasing, particularly with their heart. So it's important to keep things like that in mind, because this is one of the big differences between owner-occupiers and an investor. An investor won't be specifically interested in a specific school district. They'll just be interested in being next to a school, public transport, and all of those amenities. But specific school districts is something that an owner-occupier will be very, very interested in.
For sure. So if you do that step alone correctly, you're in a really good position to see the value of your investment grow as the other owner-occupiers fight to get into that same area because of, like you said, potentially the school districts or other amenities, and thus increasing the value of your investment. The next big thing here when researching is knowing that location is king. Do you want to say that again?
Location is king.
So it's said a lot in the property world. Location does 80% of the heavy lifting. So you get your location right, you've done 80% of the job. Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that?
So as a very general rule of thumb, the closer you are to the CBD, the better you are. Why is that? For a few reasons. You're closer to the employment hubs. You're closer to amenities such as restaurants, bars, parks, and all of that. You're closer to transport and train stations. And most importantly, the closer you are, the more scarce the land is. So the closer you are to the city, the more scarce land is. And if you can find areas that are scarce in terms of land, you've usually done a good job. Now, why is scarcity so important, especially with land, Kane?
But Simply put, you can't build more land. Once it's taken, it's taken. Now, once the land is taken and built, your only really options now are to build out wider or go higher. And I know you've got a little thing here with the building higher that you want to have a mention.
It's really interesting because I came across an article not too long ago where in the CBD people were selling airspace. Which means you're not even buying land, you're literally buying air. So in the CBD, there's limitations as to how high you can build. So if I own a property that's maybe 20 stories high, and I've got rights to build up to 30 stories high, I can sell the airspace to effectively say, well, I'm going to stop at 20, and I'm going to sell the airspace above mine to another developer so he can build an additional 10 stories that I've chosen to forego.
What a crazy idea!
Yeah, so
that's a podcast on its own. Yeah. First air property buyers agency. We're gonna have to start that soon.
Yeah, so that just shows you the value of land because it's to the point that now air has value because the land is so scarce. There's not much land available, and the air has become valuable now because there's nowhere else to build.
For sure. So we spoke really quickly last episode about how everything in economics comes down to supply versus demand. And just like you're saying now of the airspace, when land is scarce and you own it, you own the supply. And the supply isn't increasing, because you obviously now you have to buy air.
Yeah.
So if the supply isn't increasing, the demand's always going to outweigh the supply, which in turn leads to an increase in capital growth.
So if you were to print out a map of a city, let's take Sydney for example, and put a dot in the city centre, then drew concentric circles for every 10, 20, 30, 40 kilometres. What you will also see is that every wider circle, there is more land. If you look at the first 10 kilometres, the circle there isn't a lot of options. But if you go out wider to the next circle, there is a lot more suburbs in that circle in all directions. And the further you go out, the more options you have. And while still being the same distance away from the city, which makes it less scarce, the further you are from the city.
Beautiful. So we actually put up a photo to explain that point because it might be a bit difficult to understand that without an image. So if you jump on our social media pages, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, and type in First Brick Property Buyers, will pop up there. It's the latest post. We'll also put a link in the show notes. It's a really good point though. You'll really be able to visualize that the further out in the circles you get, there are so many more options. You can be 40 kilometers north, 40 kilometers east, 40 kilometers south, maybe not 40 kilometers east, you'll be in the water, but 40 kilometers west. And there's just so many options in that 40 kilometer ring, but you're still 40 kilometers away. So there's less demand for those properties because there's so many more options. Whereas when you're in that inner circle, that 10 or the 20 kilometer, there's really much less to choose from. And if you own that, then you're in a good position.
So we've spoken a lot here about research. Surely that's all we need to do.
Almost. It's another thing you should look at when you're doing your research is looking for areas undergoing gentrification. So high growth areas. These obviously help your investment as they give you a nice return when they grow. What's gentrification? You're probably thinking this guy's again spitting out random words. Doesn't even make sense. So gentrification, it's a general term for the arrival of wealthier people in an existing urban district. A related increase in rents and property values becomes associated with it and changes in the district's character and culture. So that probably also made no sense. I'll give you a real quick example. So an example of an area that underwent gentrification is Chippendale in Sydney, for example. So if you remember Chippendale, it used to just be an old brewery site and the Abercrombie Hotel. Well, the hotel is no more. The old brewery site has been named the best tall building in the world, and the few streets parading as a suburb just earned their stripes. Gone are most of the creaky, shaky the share houses in favour of some true architectural delights and even some green parklands, courtesy of wildly expensive residential development. One Central Park, the area is now home to Kensington Street Social, urban outlets, Sunday markets, and a palace cinema. So picking out these areas that are in the process of gentrification, it's not easy, but there are some signs that can point you to it. For example, if you see an area where there's a lot of old homes being renovated for a more modern look, you'll find the aspirational class moving in, for example. So you'll see more Audis and Lexuses, for example, in driveways. If you see Mercedes, it's too late. It's too late. They're not aspirational. They've made it, right? So the Audis and the Lexuses, that's the aspirational class.
That's where it starts, is it?
That's where it starts. So you see that, and you see the new couples, starting in their careers. They can't afford to get too close to the city, for example, but they're close enough in an area that's undergoing developments. You're getting new restaurants, new cafes, new hip bars, and that's where the young couples starting their careers with a little bit of money want to live. And these are areas that are undergoing gentrification, and these are the areas that you start to see nice capital growth. So it's a huge topic, and we'll dedicate a whole podcast to that later. I'll keep going while my co-host is having a coughing fit in the corner. So knowing where to invest.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. Don't do it again.
My apologies.
So knowing where you are investing is a key part of research. That doesn't mean buy where you live, does it? Though it doesn't mean buy in the same suburb I live in, does it?
Well, no. So, do you really know the growth rates in that suburb? Obviously, you know that suburb, you know the areas, but how much do you actually know? Do you know the growth rates? Do you know the vacancy rates? Do you know the affluence level? What this means is doing all the research on the area to know it well and be confident when you come to buying. For example, it's also important to note that each city has its own charms and its own attractions. If we look at Sydney again, being close to the beach and the city is very desirable. But if you look at Brisbane, and I found this really interesting, it might be unwise if you pick an investment that's closer to the beach rather than closer to the river, because the beach there is different from the beaches in Sydney. So it's important to really understand the characteristics of each city.
Yeah, great. So when we say really know where you're buying, what we really mean is really do the research. So everything we've just been talking about, all those little hints when researching, you have to really research and really know the area you're looking at and understand the charm and the characteristics of that area. So we'll quickly go through some other data points that might help you do your research when you're along the journey. So we'll just bounce off a few data points that you should probably be looking at. Maybe it'll help you in your next search.
So for me, I always like to start by looking at the rental yields, which is what's the rent that you're going to get based on the investment that you're going to put into the property.
Beautiful. So another point you want to probably look at is the 3-month, 12-month, 3-year, the 5-year, and the 10-year growth rates. These are obviously very important to see the trends in the area and to see, is it growing, is it not growing, has it grown too much, has it passed its peak? So very important to look at that data metric point.
And also if there's average vendor discounts given in particular suburbs, how much are vendors discounting their rent just to try and get some tenants into these places?
Yep. The average hold period is a very important point, as it can really show you the demand or the supply in an area. So the longer the period that a property is held in an area, it can explain how sought after that area might be. So if it's a really long hold period, say 30 years is the average hold period in an area, it's showing you that there's not a lot of stock that gets onto the market, which is going to tie into the next point as well.
Which is pretty much the days on the market. How quickly are the properties getting sold once they hit the market? Again, a lower number here means they're not lasting, they're getting snapped up, whereas higher numbers mean that the demand may not be there.
Yeah, great. Next point I would say to look at is the auction clearance rates. So this is a similar one to the days on market. It's just going to show you how much demand is in the area and how quickly or how many properties are getting sold at auctions in a particular area. So obviously 100% means every single property going to auction is getting sold straight away. 0 is saying none of the properties that went to auction are being sold. So that might give you an indication of certain features of an area.
Yeah, and also the percentage of renters in the market as opposed to owner-occupiers. Now this gets a little bit tricky because here you want renters to be around the 30% mark. Too high, that means there may be too many owner-occupier appeal, and too little may mean that you won't be able to get a tenant. So you want a good balance there.
Yeah, so percentage of renters in the market as opposed to owner occupiers is a very important one that we look at for sure. And another one, we'll leave you with another one is vacancy rates. So obviously, if the vacancy rates are too high, you might not be able to get a tenant for a long period of time, which means you're losing money because you're not getting rent. If you go back to the number crunching point, and a vacancy rate that's really small or smaller is obviously a better figure.
So there are a few points that you do need to consider. And this isn't even an exhaustive list. This is probably just a guide, but it shows how valuable research is and why it's really important to do your research. So after doing all of that, we finally found a property. Surely we're done now. We can sign the contract.
Look, you're almost there, but before you go signing anything, you really want to do some due diligence. It's very important to get your building and pest inspection sorted. You will not believe how many people buy properties without spending the $400 to get this report. This very inexpensive report can save you hundreds of thousands of dollars in the long run, and I'm not exaggerating. You might find structural damage. You might find termites. You might find nothing at all. But without doing this building and pest inspection, you don't know. And that's a very expensive risk that I personally don't want to take. Would you take that risk?
I would definitely not take that risk.
Building and pest inspection reports also, they're quite a good way to negotiate the price. Here's a little trick. Sometimes there's minor issues that need fixing, and you might be able to use that report to just knock off some of the sale price, just using that report as a negotiation tool. So it's definitely worth the $400 to get a building and pest inspection report. Very important.
And the other thing you want to do when doing your due diligence is to get a solicitor or a conveyancer to look at your contract carefully. You never know when a funny clause might just get slipped into that contract, and a good solicitor will be able to point it out, and that can avoid a huge headache for you in the long run. The last thing you want to do is get stuck in a contract that's a little bit shady.
Finally, if you have done all this and the property ticks all the boxes, congratulations. You have found yourself a great investment property.
So this is the point where we can pull out the champagne.
We pull out the champagne, we pull out the bubbly, call the friends over, start to celebrate. This is the time to have a good time.
All right. So we've gone through a lot of information here. It's a pretty jam-packed episode, I must say.
It was a very jam-packed episode. You might need to listen to it 2 or 3 times.
At least.
Yeah.
But let's recap. So what was the first step?
Step number 1, start with the end in mind.
Then you need to sort out your finances and you need to set the strategy.
And then you got to do your numbers. And just quickly here, step 3 and 4, which is setting a strategy and doing your numbers, they can be interchanged if doing your numbers first helps set your strategy. After that, you want to do your research.
Not search?
Research.
100%. And then you must do your due diligence.
Remember, if you feel like this is all a lot of work, or you don't know where to start, or have the time, we run a property buyers agency here called First Brick Property Buyers Agency, where we do all this every day, all day, for all levels of investors to make sure they get the right property. So feel free to message us on our social media pages or our email hello@firstbrick.com.au, and we'd love to give you a helping hand. Otherwise, you've got our tips on how to do it yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a big difference between getting someone like a buyer's agent to help you out with all of this, because no matter how much research you think you're doing, there's always more that can be done.
There you have it, folks. The second episode of the First Brick Property Podcast has come to an end. That was fun.
That was fun. We should definitely do this.
We'll do it again if you'd like to grace our podcast again and not leave us hanging like last week. We'd love to have you. So to all the listeners, we hope you enjoyed it. Sorry about that helicopter that just flew past if you heard it. It's quite close to the ground. So we apologize for that. But we hope you enjoyed it all, and now you can see how to choose the right investment property. Before we end, I'd like to just offer a little something to our awesome, amazing listeners. A lot of these data points can be a bit hard to find, or you may have to pay for data subscriptions. If you find the property you're interested in, send us a message and we'll get you a property report for free. Just mention you heard the offer on our podcast and we'll be happy to help you out. That is a limited time offer and it's only for our really new listeners who've been supporting us from our very first episode.
Does this apply to co-hosts as well? I might start looking for a property if that's the case.
Of course, mate. Send it to us anytime.
Done.
So you can find a lot of our content on our Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn pages. Just search First Brick Property Buyers Agents and Buyers Agency, and it should pop up there. If you have any topics that you'd like to be discussed on the podcast or have any questions, we plan to do some Q&A episodes in the future. Please send us a message on our socials or email us, like I said before, at hello, that's HELLO, at firstbrick.com.au. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe so you don't miss an episode. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and a whole other range of podcast listening devices. Also, if you'd like to give us a rating, preferably 5-star, but we'll take anything we can get. Buying property is our passion. Helping you do it is our mission. See you, mate.
Thank you, guys.